So welcome to our program. I'm Tracy Bonfitto. I'm the curator of art at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm so thrilled to be here today to have a conversation with our guests about one of the Ransom Center's most popular and beloved paintings. And it's an untitled self-portrait by Frida Kahlo, known as Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird. For those of you in Austin, you may have seen the painting on display at the Ransom Center. And if you haven't, I hope that you'll be able to visit us in the future and see the work in person. The incredible details, the vibrancy of the colors, the careful shading, and the expression on Carlo's face are really eye-catching any way you see it, online or in print, but it's just dazzling to see in person. The painting has been a prominent feature in a number of exciting exhibitions around the world, and I'm so pleased to have here with me in conversation two curators who recently organized two of those exhibitions. We have here Adriana Zavala, Associate Professor at Tufts University, with joint appointments in the departments of Art History and in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora Studies. And Adriana curated Frida Kahlo Art Garden Life at the New York Botanical Garden in 2015. So welcome to you, Adriana.
Very much.
We also have Layla Bermeo, the Kristin and Roger Servison Associate Curator of Art of the Americas at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And Layla curated Frida Kahlo and Arte Popular at the MFA in 2019. So welcome to you, Layla.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Our guests and I will be talking about the different visions behind their innovative exhibitions and how the Ransom Center's self-portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird was a pivotal part in bringing each of those visions to life in the gallery. But before we hear from our guests about their thoughts on the painting and how they have exhibited it, I'd like to just briefly share a little bit of background about Kahlo and about the work. So, Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird was done in 1940 at a time when Kahlo had certainly met with some professional success. She had exhibited in San Francisco, in New York, and in Paris, for example. It is one of 55 self-portraits by Kahlo. And those viewers who are familiar with the span of Kahlo's work will know that her style of portraiture varied over time. So in the 1940s, in the early 1940s, when this painting was done, Carlo did a number of self-portraits in this style, the single figure, the sort of head and shoulders view, whereas both before and after this period, a number of her self-portraits were more compositions that included multiple figures, oftentimes full body views. And these oftentimes were more overtly political in nature. Kahlo was born in 1907 in Coyoacan, which is today part of Mexico City, and she was educated at the prestigious Escuela Nacional Preparatoria. She started creating self-portraits as a self-taught painter during her convalescence after what was a really life-changing serious bus accident in 1925 that left her immobilized for some time. So Kahlo, of course, famously married renowned artist Diego Rivera in 1929. The couple divorced in 1939 and remarried a year later, and that's the same year that Kahlo painted the self-portrait that is now part of the Ransom Center's collection. So Kahlo, of course, was an artist, but she was also a collector and a teacher, as well as a political activist. She died in 1954 after a period of increasingly failing health. Today, you can visit her birthplace and her home in Mexico City. It's known as Casa Azul or Blue House, which is now a museum. And I know Adriana will be talking more about that space. People have read Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird in a variety of ways as a record of Kahlo's personal strength and resilience. It's also been viewed as a statement of political, religious, and cultural belief. The painting's various elements and Kahlo's hairstyle and clothing have all been closely analyzed for meaning. The Ransom Center acquired the self-portrait in 1965. It was part of a large collection of artworks assembled by Nicholas Marai, who was an important photographer and who, of course, had a very close and intimate relationship with Kahlo. In addition to the self-portrait, the collection includes a 1951 still life by Carlo, and that's still life with Parrot and Fruit, and also a 1930 sketch by Carlo that depicts her with their husband, Diego Rivera, and it's entitled Diego y Yo, and it's inscribed by Carlo to Marai. The collection also includes a large number of works by Miguel Covarrubias, many of his original illustrations, as well as works by other artists who were active in Mexico in the first half of the 20th century, including Rufino Tamayo, for example. The collection is today known as the Nicholas Marai Collection of Mexican Art, and it can be explored on our website. I invite viewers to do that. The Kahlo self-portrait was very recently returned to the Ransom Center from a loan to the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art in Denmark, where it was featured in an exhibition entitled Fantastic Women, Surreal Worlds from Merritt Oppenheim to Frida Kahlo. And that exhibition was organized by curator Ingrid Pfeiffer of the Schirn Museum in Frankfurt, Germany, where the exhibition first opened in February of 2020. This most recent exhibition expanded the notion of an international network of women surrealists to include artists working in the United States and in Europe and in Mexico. And Kahlo's self-portrait was put in conversation in those galleries with works by such artists as Leonore Carrington, Jacqueline Lamba, Alice Rehon, Greta Knudsen, and a number of others, both well-known and lesser known. This most recent exhibition explored some of the rich intellectual life of Frida Kahlo, and there's so much more to say about the topic, which we will get into today. So adding to this rich story, our two guests today have taken very different approaches in each of their exhibitions, and I think one of the most exciting things about this painting is all of the different avenues it opens up for consideration, and there are many. So I'm going to begin first with a couple of questions for Adriana, who included Kahlo's self-portrait in her innovative exhibition at the New York Botanical Garden in 2015 called Frida Kahlo, Art, Garden, Life. Adriana, perhaps you could begin by just describing your exhibition for our viewers and maybe briefly share why you saw the self-portrait as a key part of it. So this was an exhibition with a few different elements or parts to it, isn't that right?
Absolutely, yeah. It was really the opportunity of a lifetime, and I still have such gratitude to the New York Botanical Garden for inviting me to curate it. And I will say that the origin of the idea was theirs. They are the ones who approached me. I remember the day that the former president of the New York Botanical Garden, Gregory Long, called me and wanted to have a conversation about doing a Frida Kahlo exhibition at the Botanical Garden. And it struck me as an incredibly unusual proposition. I was familiar with the Botanical Garden. I have family in Westchester County, and so I had visited the garden actually quite recently when Gregory called me. And initially I was sort of surprised. I thought, well, that's a really unusual thought. But, as we began the conversation, they, as plants people, were very interested in the fact that so many Frida Kahlo paintings include both plants and animals. And so that was their entry point. They were obviously familiar with Frida Kahlo because I think you'll hardly find anyone in the world who doesn't at least know who she is. And so the idea for the exhibition really developed as a collaboration. And that was also one of the really enriching aspects of the experience. Gregory Long was intimately involved in conceptualizing what we were doing, as was Karen Dowdman, Joanna Groark, who is still at the Botanical Garden and is my former master's student. She and I work together very closely. Todd Forrest is the vice president of horticulture. Fran Coelho was the person who designed the plant installation. And then we also brought in a Tony Award-winning scenic designer named Scott Pask to do the set pieces that were in the glass house at the garden. So it was a sort of multidisciplinary exhibition. So we, of course, my part of it as an art historian was primarily to sort of amplify the context and to be sure that what we were communicating to our audiences was historically accurate and really a rich narrative about Frida Kahlo. And of course, we had an art exhibition, and the Ransom's self-portrait was the centerpiece of that show. It was actually the first painting that was a confirmed loan. And this was an unusual undertaking because part of what we had to do in our outreach to institutions was convince institutions that it made sense to hold an art exhibition at a botanical garden. And so in 2013, 5 of us went to Mexico City and did a lot of sort of diplomatic efforts to explain what the botanical garden was and what it was we were proposing to undertake. And that was really interesting. But I remember the day that I got the call from Joanna Rourke letting me know that the Ransom Center had approved the loan. And I was just beyond thrilled because it is such a spectacular painting, as you described it, Tracy. It's absolutely beautiful. And it is such a good example of mature Frida Kahlo, both in the format, in the technical rendering of her self-portrait. The handling of the paint is extraordinary, the surface quality, the color, the luminosity, and then of course the complex iconography with the hummingbird pendant, the thorn necklace, the incredible silver butterfly brooches that are in her hair, the plant life, the little sort of flowers turning into insects that are hovering above her head. It truly is a masterpiece. And I remember telling Joanna that if this is the only painting that is approved as a loan, we will build an exhibition around this painting. And of course, we were very fortunate ultimately to get 14 loans altogether, including the still life with Parrot, also from the Ransom collection. So we had an exhibition in the library at the Botanical Garden that featured 14 original Kahlo works, from the self-portrait with hummingbird necklace to a sketch of a very early sketch by Frida Kahlo that is a whimsical arrangement of little blades of grass, little dried leaves, a little spider, all arranged sort of seemingly randomly on a sort of brown paper ground. And so we have the art exhibition. And then of course, the opportunity of doing this at the Botanical Garden was that we were able to, working with Fran Coelho, design this extraordinary garden to not create a replica of Frida Kahlo's garden at the Casa Azul, but rather to evoke the feeling of the Casa Azul and what it was that Frida Kahlo, working with Diego Rivera, were aspiring to create as a natural landscape in Coyoacan at the Blue House at the Casa Azul. And we learned a great deal as we were undertaking the research. So in undertaking the research, both for the art exhibition and also for the installation in the glass house, the set pieces that Scott Pask designed for us, you know, we spent time at the Casa Azul doing research in the archive, talking with people there. And it turned out that the person in charge of the garden at the Casa Azul was actually an artist in his own right. His name is Humberto Spinola. And we ended up commissioning him to create, he's a paper artist. And we commissioned him sort of on the spot because we were so impressed and surprised to have this encounter with him. We commissioned him to create 2 dresses, paper dresses, life size, inspired by the painting of 2 Fridas. And so we have that installed as well. And for example, Humberto Spinola taught us that the garden as it exists today at the Casa Azul is not the same garden that existed when Frida and Diego lived there, because when they lived there, the trees were much smaller and the garden was much drier. So it was really an opportunity to do some original research and to bring that content forward to audiences through the lens of the humanities. Of course, this was part of a series of such exhibitions that the Botanical Garden has done.
Yeah. It's so exciting. It's I love this idea of having this really immersive experience where the visitor can imagine or evoke her Kahlo's home and studio, but also I think some of that cosmopolitan intellectual world that she operated in. I think it really offered visitors something unique. And am I right that it was also enlivened by performances from time to time? There was a series of performances.
Absolutely. So we had some artists in residence or guest artists. So in addition to the art exhibition and the extraordinary installation in the glass house, and also I will say the grounds of the Botanical Garden, there were sections where existing planted landscapes were interpreted for the visitors in relation to Frida Kahlo. And we had poetry in the landscape. The Botanical Garden has a longstanding relationship with the Poetry Society of America. And so we had poetry in the landscape that was inspired or evocative of Kahlo's life and times and her imagery and her sort of self-styling and sort of surrealistic understanding of the natural world. But we also had a beautiful installation, for example, that, for Dia de Muertos, where we commissioned an artist named Andrea Arroyo, who's a New York-based artist of, if I recall correctly, Mexican descent. And she did an altar installation on the pyramid that Scott Pask designed that is a very close evocation of the pyramid that actually Diego Rivera designed and installed in the garden at the Casa Azul. So we celebrated Dia de Muertos, Day of the Dead, with this sort of collaboration between Andrea Arroyo and Scott Pask. I had seen a concert of a wonderful trio of brothers who are called the Villalobos brothers, who are virtuoso violinists. And I had, by happenstance, seen them play a concert here in Boston, and I knew that they were based in the Bronx. And of course, the Botanical Garden is in the Bronx. So immediately I said, we must invite these guys to be our musical artists in residence. And they were in residence for the 6-month run of the exhibition. They performed multiple times on the gardens outdoors. We had the all-female mariachi group called Flor de Toloache, who's based in New York City. They performed. We had dance troops. We had a taco truck. And so there was really, you know, I, as an art historian born in Mexico City, but raised in the United States, I really think of so much of what I do is to be a good ambassador for Mexican culture. And that was part of the joy of this exhibition, is that it was multimedia, it was immersive, it was experiential. And it was really an opportunity to bring to audiences in the United States, in the greater New York area and beyond, the richness and the beauty of Mexican culture.
So Adriana, your exhibition, as you mentioned, was part of a larger series at the Botanical Garden that explored the lives and works of a number of cultural figures, right? So including Charles Darwin, Emily Dickinson, for example. And it considered these figures not only as we're used to thinking about them, as the artists, the writers, the scientists that we know them to be, but also as gardeners. So what do we gain, do you think, from exploring the gardening life of Frida Kahlo?
Well, you know, this extended series that the Botanical Garden developed, I think it was in the early 2000s, had an exhibition on Darwin, one on the gardens of the Alhambra, on Emily Dickinson, on Monet, of course. You know, this was part of what was exciting to me about this proposition, is that when we began the project, you know, we had some ideas and intuitions and hopes and hypotheses about why Kahlo included so much plant life in her painting. You know, ultimately, I think we discovered that Frida Kahlo was not a gardener, in the sense that we didn't find her trowel and her kneeling pad and her gardening gloves. And it would have been extremely uncharacteristic for a woman of her background and social class to have taken that kind of interest. It does appear that Diego Rivera was very interested in the landscape as an opportunity to explore and affirm a sort of nationalist cultural project agenda. And I think that Kahlo was very much on board with that, as we say. You know, they did, I think, together reconceptualize what had been her family's home, expand the garden. They acquired 2 adjacent pieces of property so that the whole complex of what is today the Casa Azul was expanding as they were living there. But I think that, you know, it was so important to me as an art historian, as a feminist, as somebody who's written about women artists, and as a Mexican woman myself, a Mexican-American woman myself, to push beyond the sensationalistic approaches to Frida Kahlo. I mean, she did live an extraordinary life, and extraordinary events sort of intersected in her life. But my interest in Kahlo has always been in Kahlo the intellectual, and less so in the sort of drama of her life. You know, there's some validity to that approach, but I think it gets overplayed. And I think the reason it gets, the after effect or the side effect of it being overplayed is that sometimes audiences, you know, Frida fetishists forget that her primary mode of expression was as a visual artist. And that takes incredible creativity, intelligence, resilience, determination, perseverance, particularly in mid-century Mexico, for a woman to live their lives the way that Frida Kahlo and several other women did. There weren't a lot of them. I mean, there was Frida Kahlo, there was Lola Alvarez Bravo, they were friends. There was Maria Izquierdo, they were not friends. There were several sort of formidable women artists, but this was not a simple thing to do. And so for me, my orientation towards Kahlo has always been to prioritize her creativity, her intellect, and her resilience. And so when the botanical garden folks, when the plants people pointed out to me that they wanted to do this exhibition, I thought, well, this is really an opportunity to offer the public a beautiful and exuberant exhibition that will captivate people, but it's an opportunity to teach people both about the complexity of Kahlo's intellect and her life, and also of Mexican culture. And so I'm very proud to have done this project and for it to be part of the series that looked at, you know, Darwin's experiments in plant life, and Emily Dickinson's own garden, and she was a gardener, and its relationship to her poetry, or, you know, the experiments that Monet was doing in his plant boxes and how those informed the extraordinary paintings he went on to do. So I think Kahlo really fits extraordinarily well, even if she wasn't putting on the gloves and digging in the dirt. I do believe that the vision of what the garden at the Casa Azul became was part of her vision. You know, in the 1940s, she was at times very much confined to that space as her disabilities became more intense. And I don't doubt, given her self-fashioning and her attention to that, that she was fashioning her home in a way that was unusual and idiosyncratic and special. And so this was an opportunity to help the general public understand that through the lens of citizen science and citizen humanities, which I believe firmly in, that we can, you know, speak in a way that is appealing to a public, and along the way teach them something about science and about the humanities and about how these things intersect with each other to give us more knowledge about the world.
I think it also sounds like this exhibition was such a great way to think about Frida Kahlo as a collector, which I think has some really great resonance with what we'll be hearing from Layla. So I'll kind of table that for a second. But I also want to ask you, Adriana, about one of the things that you explored in the gallery display, which was the concept of hybridity and these sort of layered identities. And I think the concept of having this flexibility of self is something that we see a lot of in Kahlo's art. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Kahlo's inclusion of nature and natural imagery provides a sort of unique entry point for exploring those identities.
Absolutely. So, you know, I think that, you know, there are multiple places, multiple origins for this interest for Kahlo. I mean, one of them is the pre-Columbian world and pre-Columbian cosmologies. You know, we know that the Aztec civilization adhered or valued a concept of duality. You know, some of the principal deities in the Aztec pantheon are dualistic. They have male and female. They're both terrifying and sublime. And you know, I'm not saying Kahlo was an expert of that, but this was a period during Kahlo's lifetime was a period when Mexican intellectuals were really beginning to understand that and take an interest in it. And so I think that one of the roots of interest is historical. It has to do with the ways in which revolutionary intellectuals were looking to the pre-Columbian past to understand an alternative worldview to the Western European, and then thinking about how that carried forward into their present. Of course, Mexico is a country that is a cultural amalgamation of European and indigenous and Asian and, you know, many different cultures that came together during the colonial period. And that was still very influential in the minds of Mexican intellectuals in the 20s and the 30s. You know, Mexico has a symbolic discourse of mestizaje. Mestizaje is the term that means mixture in Spanish. And there's a symbolic discourse in Mexico that all Mexicans are mestizos. That's not true. There are white identified Mexicans. There are purely indigenous people living in the Mexican nation. But in the 1920s, this idea that Mexico was a fused culture was very popular, and that was very much part of sort of Kahlo's intellectual formation. But it's on the one hand a melting pot ideology, and on the other hand, there's valid valuation given to the pieces of that mixture, right? And I think Kahlo was very interested in that. And of course, Kahlo's father was from Germany. And I think she was very, very aware of the fact that she was not a typical Mexican mestiza, right? Her mother was a mestiza, but she herself was half European and also very much identified with her father. So I think she had an interest in hybridity and in duality that was both validating and also complex and problematic, because these were also the years of eugenics and of the Nuremberg laws. And I think Kahlo was very aware of that. As a part of the German community, there was a powerful German community in Mexico, and there were within the German community anti-fascists, and there were also fascists. And so I have no doubt that an understanding of genealogy was at times at the forefront of Kahlo's mind. So that also fuels this interest in hybridity. And then I think through her father, Kahlo had a love of the natural world. She described in letters to friends that she and her father would spend time walking along the river in Coyoacan and gathering plant specimens. And that's also very consistent with a kind of German positivist intellect that her father would have imparted to her. And she herself went to the National Preparatory School, which was very much grounded in sort of positivistic, sort of rational observation of the natural world. But this manifests in important ways in her art, right? So that's all the background. So what does she do with that? Well, I think it's actually when she comes to the United States. I think her experience in the United States from 1930 to 34 is really formative for Kahlo. And it's in that period that she paints the extraordinary Luther Burbank painting. And here again is an instance of a botanist who was something of a popular celebrity in the United States prior to his death. And, Kahlo never met Burbank. He had already died, but she visited his home with Rivera. And of course, Rivera depicted Luther Burbank in his mural at the Pacific Stock Luncheon Club of the Pacific Stock Exchange. So Luther Burbank was on people's minds. He was endeavoring to create hybrid plants to increase the world's food supply. He had some very unusual ideas about the relationship of humans and nature. And that is really one of the earliest Kahlo paintings where she really does something unusual with the relationship between the human realm and the natural world, and this question of hybridity. And she depicts him as, a being emerging from a tree. And then there's a buried body, a deceased body beneath the roots of the tree. And she does a sketch for that painting. So, we exhibited both the sketch and the painting as a way to show audiences that art is process. It doesn't just erupt spontaneously on the canvas. And that was true for Kahlo as well. And then during her time in the US, she paints some really interesting, as you mentioned, there's this early period of Kahlo in the 30s where she's making these complex figural compositions that are certainly informed by a knowledge of surrealism. So one of the very first is the Luther Burbank painting, and another one is the self-portrait on the borderline between the US and Mexico, where she depicts herself in Detroit. And the plant life there is very important as well. It's unusual, it's very tropical, and it's a counterpoint to the sort of industrial technology of the United States. And then even in the tragic painting that shows her miscarriage in Detroit, there's a very unusual orchid flower there that sort of represents a kind of crushed fecundity. So I think that the natural world provided Kahlo an allegorical framework for expressing these ideas of the interdependence between the human realm and the natural world, and the dualism of life and death, of male and female, of fertility and fecundity, and the absence of fertility and fecundity, which of course was relevant to her own experience.
You've given us so many great things to think about. I guess for my next question, I just want to maybe think about just a single takeaway for somebody listening to this program. I mean, we can no longer experience this exhibition, unfortunately, at the Botanical Garden, but what do you hope the the lasting legacy of your intervention will be? Or to put it again in another way, what do you hope someone listening to this program will take away from learning about it?
My hope for the legacy of the exhibition is that people come to it, to the catalog or to the information that's still available online, or perhaps they pursue, the painting that the Ransom Center owns, and then they find the exhibition through that portal. I really hope that people come away with a more complicated understanding, both of Frida Kahlo and of Mexican culture, and of the richness and the vitality and the complexity and contradiction of the revolutionary era in Mexico. This was such a vital and vibrant moment in Mexican history, the 20s, 30s, 40s. And there are endless ways that we can approach that history and try to understand the cultural history and try to understand artists like Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. So if biography is the entry point, that's fine. I don't begrudge that. But I hope that by taking a perspective on Frida Kahlo's relationship to flora and fauna and to the natural world and to, cosmological principles such as the interdependence of humans in the natural world, that they really begin to understand what a complicated intellect and creative individual Frida Kahlo was. And that she was a collector, and I know we'll talk about that, but she really curated her life. And we see that in her paintings, we see that in her manner of dress, we see that in the expression of her home. And that takes incredible creativity and historical understanding and just dynamism and love of life. I mean, there was so much tragedy in Frida Kahlo's life, but there was also passion and color and vibrancy and food and music and drink and animals and plants. And I really want people to come away with understanding that though she died quite young, Frida Kahlo loved life. I really do believe that she loved life, notwithstanding its tragedy.
That's another reason why I think your exhibition was so fantastic, is that it had those sights, those sounds, those smells, that vibrancy. It had the performative aspect to it as part of it. So you mentioned that there's a companion catalog for your exhibition, which of course is another great way that viewers can further explore your ideas. But I also know that you are currently working on a different, very exciting book project. And I wonder if I could ask you to share a little bit about that with our audience.
Sure. So, one of my primary research fields is mid 20th century Mexico, or the 30s and 40s. And I've long had an interest, I think in part because I'm a bicultural person and I've lived my life in the United States. I have a passion for Mexico City. It's such an extraordinary place. It's so rich in culture and rich in history. And you go there and you can really see that Mexico City is a palimpsest of historical eras and sort of cultural influences. And so several years ago, I began to take an interest in Mexico City as a place and as an idea for artists. And I wrote an essay about the painter Juan O'Gorman, there's a Kahlo connection there because he and Kahlo were very, very close friends. And O'Gorman collaborated with Diego Rivera and Kahlo to design the pair of international style homes that they occupied in the 1930s when they weren't living at the Casa Azul. That site is today the Diego Rivera Casa Estudio, House and Studio. And it's in the neighborhood adjacent to Coyoacan that's called San Angel. And so I had always had an interest in Juan O'Gorman, and Juan O'Gorman painted a tempera painting that's called Landscape or Cityscape of Mexico City. That's a view of Mexico City in 1949, and it's a very provocative painting. And O'Gorman's painting was very similar to Frida Kahlo's. He was a meticulous artist. He also painted in tempera on panel with very, very fine brushes, as Frida Kahlo did. So I had long loved that painting, in part because of my own love of Mexico City as a member of the diaspora. And a colleague of mine, Delio Cosentino, had taken an interest in pictorial maps that artists like Carlos Merida and Emily Edmonds were creating in the 1930s. And these are maps of Mexico City that are pictorial, that both draw on pre-Columbian map-making traditions and Western European map-making traditions, but they also appear at a moment when Mexican intellectuals are very aware that Mexico City is becoming a tourist destination. So they're actually utilitarian maps. So Delia and I had this shared interest in images of the urbanscape. And so now we're sort of in the last stretch of a book project that right now we're calling Resurrecting Tenochtitlan. And Tenochtitlan is, of course, the name of the Aztec capital city that lies beneath modern day Mexico City. And it's a project that looks at the convergence of new archaeological knowledge of the Aztec city with an understanding of the contemporary city and how these things converge and map onto each other. And so it includes information about archaeological discoveries in the 20s and the 30s, to a chapter on Diego Rivera's extraordinary mural that represents the Aztec capital on the eve of the Spanish conquest, another chapter on Juan O'Gorman. And I think in some ways it's related to the Kahlo project because it's that same circle of intellectuals who felt so deeply their connection to Mexican culture and wanted to celebrate Mexico and Mexico City in all of its complexity and contradiction.
We are definitely going to keep our eyes open for that book. And we'll also continue to learn more about your exhibition in this program. But I want to now turn to Layla Bermeo and to bring her and her exhibition into the conversation. So Layla, so great to have you here. In 2019, you curated Frida Kahlo and Arte Popular at the MFA in Boston. Could you introduce that exhibition to the audience and also say a word about the role that the self-portrait played in it? Am I right that you were really interested in thinking about what inspired Kahlo in her work?
That's right. And particularly for the self-portrait, I can kind of go into that as well. That was really interesting to me because of the ways in which it relates to the painting in the MFA's collection, Dos Mujeres. So Frida Kahlo and Arte Popular, our exhibition really examined how Kahlo collected and drew inspiration from Mexican folk art, or Arte Popular, throughout her entire career. So in our galleries, her paintings were displayed alongside the types of decorated ceramics, weavings, children's toys, devotional ex voto paintings that she surrounded herself with, and sometimes even directly depicted in her paintings. We really tried to show how Kahlo collected Arte Popular as a political act in the wake of the Mexican Revolution. So as this performance of nationalism that was largely constructed by middle-class people like herself, but it was rooted in what they considered the sort of rediscovery of the arts and culture of rural, indigenous, and working class people in Mexico. Through this, I would say we tried to emphasize that Kahlo's politics really always inform her paintings, even when the subjects look kind of neutral or even playful at first glance. And so I would say one of the great privileges of organizing this exhibition on Frida Kahlo and Arte Popular was really having the opportunity to bring Dos Mujeres, or two women from our collection, in conversation with the Ransom Center's iconic self-portrait. I always thought that there were striking visual similarities between the two paintings. So in both, we have roughly bust-length figures that kind of fill most of the composition, but they're pictured in this fairly shallow space, so sort of set against this tight screen of green foliage in the background. Again, sort of evoking many of the themes that were so beautifully explored in Adriana's exhibition. Butterflies, I think Adriana mentioned, they're actually in both paintings. They're in the background of Dos Mujeres and then appear as silver brooches in Kahlo's own hair in the self-portrait. But we also see a lot of differences. This was something that I liked to discuss with visitors, especially students of art or art history, when they came in. What are the sort of similarities and differences between these two paintings? Kahlo's face, as we also mentioned, is just beautifully shaded and modeled and detailed in ways that the two women, who were Salvadora and Herminia, they were the muchachas, or the domestic workers, in Kahlo's mother's home, they look really quite flat by comparison. And why is that? Really, I mean, it's because Dos Mujeres was created at the very beginning of Kahlo's career. It was actually the first painting that she ever personally sold herself. And in that way, I often wonder if we can think about it as one of her first truly professional paintings. So Adriana mentioned early on that one of the things that's so remarkable about the Ransom Center self-portrait is that it is a really incredible, maybe even the best example of mature Kahlo. And our painting is really very early Kahlo. So there is over a decade between those two paintings. And what is really exciting about that is that we can see the ways in which she developed and evolved as an artist. So in those intervening years, even though she's largely self-taught as a painter, she's looking at the works of other artists. I would argue she's looking also at arte popular and kind of teaching herself how to paint. This issue, I would say, is particularly important with Kahlo, as we've touched on, because so many questions, about her development as an artist, about the major milestones in her career, the most significant moments of her career, are often overshadowed in favor of those that focus on her personal life, her illnesses, and her romantic relationships.
Yeah. Great, thank you. You actually preemptively answered my question, which was going to be about Dos Mujeres, but I would actually like to ask you a little follow-up to that, because I think it's such a great pairing, and as you say, it's such an interesting way to think about, I guess, to remind ourselves something that we often forget, which is that she was a self-taught artist, and of course her practice evolved over time, as you said. Am I right in remembering that there was you did some work to uncover a change that had been made to that painting, that there was Carlo had made a pretty significant change to Dos Mujeres?
Yes, that's correct. And a lot of that work happened among the curators and conservators here at the MFA before my time. I would say that was one of the really exciting things about when I came to the MFA in 2016 as the very first Latina curator in the history of this museum. And Carlo was already here. In many ways, I felt like Carlo was here waiting for me. And so the painting was acquired in 2015. And there really aren't that many, especially here in the US, conservation studies on Carlo. We have many questions about how the material she used and how she actually worked, even though there are stacks and stacks of books on all of the people that she slept with. So we still have these outstanding questions about how she actually made her pictures. And so even taking an X-ray of Dos Mujeres was incredibly revealing, because I think it was known even by the earliest collectors of that painting that she had made some changes to one of the faces of the muchachas. But in fact, what we learned was that she had not only made major compositional changes to their faces, but also actually to what they're wearing. So they're dressed in these incredibly rich, kind of jewel-toned clothes. But originally she had both of them, I think, wearing white aprons. Garments that would have marked them as muchachas, as domestic workers. And she made the decision to remove that one detail that would communicate their social class in that way. I think their class is still pretty visible. I mean, one of the most exciting things about that painting is that it really would not have been possible, I don't think, before the Mexican Revolution. He's working in a moment where Rivera, that entire circle of intellectuals, is really interested in elevating the subjects of portraiture. And so these working class mixed race women become the subject of a painting in a way they probably would not have been in Mexican art in decades earlier, before the revolution.
It's just fascinating. I would love to turn now to those examples, though, of arte popular or folk art that you included in the exhibition, because I really appreciated the way that you incorporated these materials. So my question is, what can we gain by considering retablos and some of the other materials, for example, when viewing Carlo's work? And in your answer, if it makes sense to go there, if it seems relevant, perhaps you could also speak about the size or the scale, or maybe some of the materials of the works that you included, and maybe how they were displayed.
Absolutely. That's such a great question. So, I think like the issues of her development as a painter, questions about Kahlo's artistic influences and her inspirations are often not part of the popular understanding of her life and work, especially outside of Mexico. Even though she's arguably the most famous woman artist in the world, again, we still have many questions about how she worked. So by pairing a selection of Kahlo's paintings with the types of arte popular objects that may have informed her choices of subjects or of compositions or materials, we really hope to frame Kahlo as an artist and as a collector who is constantly taking in all of these different influences and creating new forms of painting, so really new forms of art. So in addition to thinking about how, colorful ceramic lions and paper mache skeletons actually had underlying political meanings, we also constantly asked what Kahlo might have been learning from these objects. So Kahlo's early biographer, Raquel Thibault, for example, suggests that arte popular taught Kahlo how to create great visual impact on a very small scale. And this is an observation that strikes me as particularly significant, given that Kahlo was creating easel paintings at a time when muralism, so when all of its kind of large scale, heroic associations with masculinity, that was nearly synonymous with modern Mexican art and progressive politics. So in one of my favorite moments in the show, we were able to display a very small work of hers, The Girl with Death Mask from the collection of the Nagoya City Art Museum in Japan, with a jaguar mask from the San Antonio Museum of Art. The great majority of our loans of arte popular came from San Antonio. And the mask was noticeably larger than the painting. And this was really the point, that Kahlo knew how big those masks were. She collected them. And she made the choice, the conscious decision to work at this really, really intimate scale. And so her engagements with arte popular, I think, have much to teach us about her processes of art making. I love how Adriana said earlier that showing a sketch with a painting can also show you something about how an artist works. So Kahlo actually painted Girl with Death Mask and some of her other paintings, particularly those I think from the 1930s, on metal supports. So in this case, she's evoking not only the size, but also the materials that were used to make ex votos, which are also called retablos. And they're kind of like painted thank you cards to God and the saints that would have been made by everyday people and put in churches. Many artists at the time were interested in ex votos. I think it's because they include imagery that kind of ruptures the boundaries between boring everyday life and the divine in ways that almost seem to anticipate surrealism. And so we see a lot of modernists gravitating toward collecting and even representing ex votos in their work. But it really seems that Kahlo is really the only one who appropriates both the style and the materials of this vernacular tradition.
It's fascinating. So I want to now circle back a little bit to something that Adriana spoke about exploring identity using the lens of the natural world. And of course, identity is such a key concept in thinking about Kahlo in terms of her art, but also really in terms of her very cultivated public persona. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about how your exhibition presented a different way of thinking about Kahlo's identity.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize that it was really important for our exhibition to focus on a single theme or to have a thesis, because projects on Kahlo so often tend to take the form of these sweeping biographies rather than the types of close scholarly examinations that we often see for studies on white male modern artists. There were very few models. Adriana's exhibition was one of the very few models that I had to look to when I was developing Frida Kahlo and Arte Popular. The theme of Arte Popular, though, as I've tried to suggest, is actually really huge and complicated, and it has all of these sub-themes. So there are political and religious dimensions, concerns about class. We had to wrestle with the fact that the majority of Arte Popular artists are unknown, so placing unknown artists in comparison with Frida Kahlo, one of the most famous artists in the world still. And so I hope that placing Kahlo's work in conversation with these objects that evoke all of these different issues also showed something about her own complexity or hybridity, that she rejected her Catholic upbringing, but still remained inspired by ex votos and other forms of religious imagery. As we've talked about, she grew up in this educated middle-class Mexican home, but really embraced and was deeply interested in her mixed mestiza and German heritage. She collected arte popular, which largely came from rural and indigenous communities, but also socialized with Rockefellers, right? She was an anti-capitalist communist, but also wanted to sell her paintings and also wanted international recognition. And so her artistic ambition, I think in particular, was something that we really tried to capture in the show, because although she championed folk art, she did not self-identify as a folk artist. And she actually became enraged when André Breton displayed her paintings as the equivalent of arte popular rather than as work inspired by it. And making this distinction was critical to our own project in a way that I hope, again, was revealing about these many hybridities or even contradictions that really characterize Kahlo and her work.
So Layla, I know that you also are beginning work on a book project, this related to your exhibition, which I think is very exciting. And I'd love to hear more about that. At this stage, are you seeing it as a reflection of the exhibition, or are there new directions that you think you'll be exploring?
That is such an interesting question. We're really right at the beginning of this project, which will be a retrospective catalog for Frida Kahlo and Arte Popular. And it will highlight many of the amazing loans that we had from the Ransom Center, from the Nagoya City Art Museum, and other public and private collections. But I think also include several works of art that we were not able to include in the original exhibition to really show the importance of Arte Popular across Kahlo's career and across her political interests. I'm hoping also that it will have more information about conservation, just again to follow up on your question about compositional changes, as well as materials that she used. And because it was really critical for our exhibition to have bilingual texts also, I'm really proud to say that this book will actually be the very first MFA catalog published in English and in Spanish.
That's great. We are definitely going to be keeping our eyes open for that. Thank you so much. I also, I have a few questions for both of you to pose to both of you, but I just want to say that I'm so proud that our painting appeared in both of your shows. These are fantastic exhibitions. They really did a lot of really great work. And I also want to know, one of the things that I enjoy most about these exhibitions that you've curated and discussed with us here, and this is something that you both touched on, but I see and appreciate a desire in both of you to sort of push back against what I believe Adriana has described elsewhere as the biographical sensationalism that tends to surround Kahlo and her work. And you've each done that in really compelling and creative ways that add a lot to the conversation. But, and this is going to be my first question for both of you, the pull of Kahlo's biography is very strong. It's a very compelling story. So my question is, was it difficult when you were planning the exhibition to resist that pull, or to find a way to keep the focus on the art? And maybe, Adriana, if we could start with you first.
Sure. I think that, I was fortunate to work with a team of people who were all in agreement that biography was not really going to be our entry point. I mean, we didn't neglect it. We had a panel exhibition. We had 2 panel exhibitions in the context of the broader project that informed the public about the sort of key milestones in Kahlo's life. But every time we presented those, we were always doing so through the lens of what is our project about? And how does this biographical narrative help the visitor understand why it's new and informative to think about Frida Kahlo in relation to the natural world? So I think, we could talk for hours and probably write reams about, biography as an art historical methodology or not. But I think at this point, we have to accept the fact that it's Kahlo's captivating life as it's been narrated that often draws people to her. So I think it's important to sort of meet audiences where they come in, and then try to amplify or shift or complicate what they think they already know. And sometimes you don't succeed. I mean, I've had plenty of conversations in the context of public lectures or, gallery talks where, people want to ask me about Kahlo's, quote unquote inability to bear children, or the multiple affairs she had with people like Nicholas Murai or Isamu Noguchi, or, and so again, I always try to bring it back around. I think it's important when you're doing this kind of work to be generous with your audiences. So I didn't feel a challenge not to be pulled towards biography, but I was always asking myself, what's really what matters here? What is the key issue? And what is it that we're trying to teach?
Yeah. Layla, did you have a hard time resisting that pull, or did you see it kind of more as a tool that you could use?
It was really my personal mandate, I think, from the beginning to distinguish our exhibition from the many projects that I would say look voyeuristically, I would argue, at the details of Kahlo's illnesses and lovers, and interpret her paintings as direct illustrations of events in her life, something I know that has also been critiqued in Adriana's work, that Kahlo is not simply making a biography in paint. At the same time, I do agree with our colleagues who say that her work invites many of these biographical readings. And I do wonder if at times, if I do neglect or stray too far away from these very real and important interpretations in my desire to simply be subversive and do something different. I also know that while Frida Kahlo and Arte Popular was overwhelmingly well received, there were certainly people who left disappointed, people who really did want to see a Salma Hayek movie on the wall. And I know this because some of them wrote to me to tell me how unsatisfied they were. And I wrote back to every one of them explaining that I had really a lot of motivations for trying to craft this show to focus on Kahlo's accomplishments as a painter rather than as a pop culture figure. But I agree very much with Adriana that, as someone who works at a museum, I have to consider not only my own interests, but also the ways that I can best serve our audiences and communities. And I think I'll continue to struggle with some of these tensions of which stories to tell, what are the key issues, but also how can I meet people where they're at as we continue to interpret and display Dos Mujeres, our own painting here at the MFA.
If you want Salma Hayek, go for Salma Hayek. That's the moral of the story. So I like to ask this next question to other creators because the process for organizing and researching an exhibition, of course, can take you on very different paths that you didn't necessarily anticipate when you first started. So my question is, what is the most surprising thing you learned in doing this work? Or was there something that you uncovered early on in your research that sort of led you into a different direction than you had anticipated going in? Layla, we could start with you.
I'm sorry, with who? With Layla?
Whoever wants to answer is fine, but Adriana.
All right. I think, we strive to teach in the work that we do, and it's important to be receptive to learning. And so this relates to the question that you're asking. I think that in my career, I have really resisted that sort of pathologizing narrative about Frida Kahlo. I find it overwhelming. I find it rather misdirected. I do understand why it's appealing. So I think that what I learned was to open my mind to a deep appreciation of the pain and suffering that Kahlo actually experienced and how her home became a haven, right? I think that because that narrative of pain and suffering has been so prevalent in accounts of her art, and as Layla said, there's this misconception that her paintings narrate her biography, and I don't believe that they do. I mean, we do know that evidently Diego Rivera may have suggested to Kahlo that an interesting thing to do would be to paint a painting exploring significant milestones in her life. She said this in an interview at one point. I think that the flip side of that is that some scholars, both sort of popular and scholarly, have kind of run with this assumption that her paintings are biographical narrations, and they're not. They're mediated. They're reinterpretations, they're reflections and evocations of. So I think my own disposition was to really resist the sort of pain and tragedy in Kahlo's life. And one thing that I learned through our project was to really sit in the space of the Casa Azul and appreciate what an extraordinary sort of space of respite and seclusion and contemplation and healing that was. I think that was probably the most important thing for me. And now when I have subsequently visited the house, although the last time I went, it was so crowded that it was really difficult to appreciate the space in that way. The popular celebrity has just intensified. And I don't doubt that our exhibition contributed to that, is the truth of the matter. There was such a crowd of people that you couldn't even sort of find a quiet corner of the garden to sit and contemplate Kahlo's life, which I do try to do now. And I do try to appreciate that she created, both in collaboration with Rivera and on her own, this extraordinary sort of space where she could sort of present herself to the world. And so that was an interesting opportunity for me.
Layla, was there something surprising that you uncovered in the early part of your research, or something that took you in a different direction?
This was my very first time working on Carlo, so I was really learning throughout. It was like every day there was a new discovery. But I initially seized on the visual comparisons between works of arte popular and Carlo's paintings, but I really was unaware of the political significance of these objects until I read all of this excellent scholarship on the topic by Mexican art historians. And interestingly, the collecting of folk art by middle and upper class people as part of an attempt to construct a national history or even an identity, these sort of ideas of unification, is happening during the first half of the 20th century, as many of you likely know, in the United States, as much as it is happening in Mexico. And so this kind of pervasiveness of collecting folk art underscores the fact that Kahlo was most definitely not the only artist who was drawing inspiration from these types of objects. So the best piece of advice that I got very early on in the process was from Professor James Oles, who's an art historian based at Wellesley College, who Adriana knows very well and has worked with extensively. And he told me, you have to show that Kahlo's not special. And by that, I took that to mean that she was not some tortured artist who was working alone in a dark vacuum, who then discovered arte popular, but that she was really part of a community of artists and intellectuals who were trying to make the edgiest, most contemporary art of the time by drawing on objects that they thought embodied a type of Mexicanidad or a pure sort of essential Mexican culture. And this wider circle that Kahlo was a part of notably included other women artists, as Adriana mentioned. And so I thought a lot as I sort of developed the project about how understudied, especially in the US, many of these women continue to be. And it became increasingly important for me to at least include some work by modern Mexican women painters who were not Frida Kahlo. So María Izquierdo, Rosa Rolanda, artists who, along with this wider international circle, were also working with the influences of arte popular.
A lot of future exhibitions here, I think. So we've been focusing here in our conversation on the self-portrait, but in your exhibitions, both of you also showcased another painting by Carlo that's part of the Ransom Center, and that's The Still Life with Parrot and Fruit from 1951. It's a really lovely, pretty small scale painting. It's got this beautiful, brightly colored fruit, and Carlo's pet parrot, Bonito, looks like he could just walk right out of the campus and have a chat with you. I wonder if each of you could talk about could each of you talk about why you also wanted to include that painting in your exhibition? Layla, maybe we could start with you.
Sure. For me, one of the most exciting sections in our show was called Naturalezas Vivas, or Living Still Lives. And it examined the anthropomorphic energies in Kahlo's still life paintings, which is a quality that we also see in arte popular. So if we think about tiny skeletons that bounce because they're made out of springs, or coconuts that are carved with faces, ceramic fruits that never rot. Your still life with Parrot and Fruit was shown with two other still lifes. So one from around the same year, and then one one from much earlier as a way to show how Kahlo engaged with this theme throughout her career, that she was drawing particularly also on 19th century still lifes, especially those from the state of Puebla, which, like Arte Popular, these are paintings that are sort of rediscovered by middle-class people in Mexico during her time. Modernists appreciated those paintings for, as you were describing, the kind of bright colors and also geometric shapes. They looked kind of modern at the time. And I think your painting in particular shows how Kahlo innovated the still life tradition, even as she worked within it. And so in this, particularly I would say in the ways in which she kind of suggests motion or living energies in these compositions. In your painting, she's filled this small canvas so aggressively with this mountain of fruits and parrots that it looks like the fruits are actually going to tumble right out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Adriana, why did you want to include the painting in your exhibition?
Well, I mean, I'll echo some of what Layla said. I think that for us, you know, because part of our exhibition was really focused on the garden at the Casa Azul as an environment that was both a site of creativity and also an environment that could inspire creativity. You know, there was a significant aspect to which the narrative of our exhibition really focused on the 40s, which is that period of mature Kahlo, where not only is she beginning to create those sort of shoulders and head single figure self-portraits, but also painting many, many still lifes. You know, she had done some still life type objects earlier on, a very early painting that shows an arrangement of sort of arte popular objects. But in the 40s, she really does appear to be spending 40s and 50s, quite a bit of time at home. There was, you know, an important market in Coyoacan where she could have sourced these things. And she had this menagerie of pets. So I was very interested in that. And so this painting featuring Bonito was important because it shows, again, the ways in which she's creating modern and contemporary art, because this was contemporary art in 1951, right? Out of material at hand, whether it's arte popular or whether it's the fruits and vegetables that perhaps one of the people in her employ had gathered at the mercado nearby, at the market. And yet then it's what she does with it, right? So I really like that Layla observed that these are modern pictures, right? They're about color, shape, geometry, time. You know, the still life, of course, is a very important genre that provides artists an opportunity to think about the passage of time. And so when we look at the Ransom still life with Parrot and Fruit, you know, we see this parted watermelon and the black seeds are almost beginning to sink into the flesh as it begins to decay. Right. So this is important. And I tried to tone down this narrative in our exhibition because I knew people were going to go there anyway. But if we're thinking about this painting in 1951, just 3 years before Kahlo dies, and the ways in which her own body was in a state of physical decay at this point. Again, I didn't feel I needed to remind people of that. Maybe some audiences didn't know that, and that's okay too. Let them learn about the painting in a different way. But for those who did understand the physical disability that Kahlo was living in the last years of her life, I think that that depiction of the watermelon, where the flesh is literally beginning to sort of just deteriorate and sink away and dry out, it's a very evocative painting. And so it's also evidence of what an artist can do with a real economy of means, right? The compositions are very simple. And the objects are very everyday, you know, citrus fruit, watermelon, mangoes, chirimoyas, prickly pear, tuna, and her pet parrot. And yet she creates something so vital and evocative and almost disturbing, frankly. So I think for the surrealists amongst her audience, that sort of uncanny, disturbing quality was very appealing as well.
Yeah. So my next question for you both, I hope this is going to be kind of a fun exercise to imagine. I hope it'll be thought-provoking, of course, but a little bit fun as well. And I'll play too, if you don't mind. If you could imagine putting the Ransom Center's Frida Kahlo self-portrait in just a small gallery with one other work by any other artist, sky's the limit, the loan request is approved, in the bag, funding is complete. What would that other artwork be and why? Layla, maybe we could start with you.
So I would put Kahlo's self-portrait in conversation with Yolanda Lopez's self-portrait as the Virgin of Guadalupe from 1978, which is widely considered to be one of the most important pictures of the Chicanx art movement. So Lopez herself, a Chicana artist, depicts her own body herself sprinting toward us wearing running shoes, and she's trampling a cherub in the process, grabbing a serpent by the throat, and wearing the starry mantle of this iconic Virgin of Guadalupe slung around her shoulders as if it's a mylar blanket that she got at the end of a race. Like Kahlo's self-portrait, I think about the ways, the self-portrait references both Christ imagery and representations of Aztec deities, as Adriana was saying earlier. Lopez's work both celebrates and critiques religious imagery. So she's holding up the Virgin of Guadalupe as a beautiful and powerful Mexican woman, one of the few examples that I would say Latinx or Chicanx people have had. But she's also breaking away from the stillness and the subservience that the original image represents. So her work is acknowledging the conventions and the histories of art while engaging with the radical politics. It's extremely personal while also evoking universal themes of spiritual and family traditions. It's concerned with her own physical body, but also with the non-human world. And I really can't think of anything more Kahlo than that.
I love that pairing. Adriana, how about you?
That's a great choice. And I think it's really interesting that Layla and I are both going in the same direction. So two things came to mind immediately. And one of them was to pair it with one of the paintings of Frida Kahlo by Rupert Garcia, who's also a Chicano artist, and somebody who has written very compellingly about the difference between sort of American pop as a kind of consumer-oriented art world style and the kind of politicized sort of pop-inflected work of the 1970s and 80s among Chicano artists. And is really a leader in that. And he did 2, if not 3, extraordinary portraits inspired by Frida Kahlo. One of which was the poster for an exhibition called Homenaje a Frida Kahlo that was at the Galleria de la Raza in San Francisco in 1978. And then he subsequently made, I think, 2 other paintings that are very much in conversation with Andy Warhol's Marilyn. But the image is Frida Kahlo. So that was one image that immediately came to my mind. And the other one would be to put the self-portrait with Hummingbird painting in conversation with one of the Chicana artist Amalia Mesa Bain's altars. She's an installation artist, very much known for creating contemporary installation art inspired by Mexican and Mexican-American home altars. And her work is at times also biographical, but it's also very political and very much in conversation, both with Mexican-American cultural traditions with Day of the Dead and also with contemporary feminist installation art. So I can't decide, I'm pulled in multiple directions. Maybe we need 4 works in a gallery and it would be Yolanda Lopez, Rupert Garcia, Amalia Mesa Bains, and Frida Kahlo.
I was thinking that. I was like, actually, like the Lopez like also fits in there. So maybe it's 1 per wall.
Yeah, there you go.
Hey, it's our fantasy exhibition. We can have whatever we want. Okay, so I'm gonna go in a little bit of a different direction for my answer. My area of expertise is actually in modern and contemporary South Asia. For a number of years, I've been interested in the work of Marita Shergill, who was roughly a contemporary of Frida Kahlo, and there actually are a lot of parallels between the two in terms of their lives. So Marita Shergill was born in Budapest to a Hungarian mother and Indian father. She had a very cosmopolitan upbringing. She was trained in the Western academic painting tradition in Paris. And she went to India as a young woman, where she sort of immediately saw this new rich visual field and this opening up of her artistic practice in a different way. Her work took a very different turn after that point. She also did quite a large number of self-portraits. So the self-portrait that I would select to pair with the Frida Kahlo self-portrait would be Marita Shergill's portrait from 1934 called Self-Portrait as a Tahitian. So in this portrait, Shergill is pictured standing. She has her hands clasped in front of her waist. She is nude from the waist up. It's a 3/4 view. She's turned slightly away from the viewer, not quite facing the viewer. She's got long hair, it's tied back in a low ponytail. It looks like she might be wearing red lipstick, but otherwise she's completely unadorned. She is standing in front of what looks like a Japanese screen with some figures on it. And there's also what appears to be the shadow behind her that looks like it could potentially be a large male shadow facing forward. So it's a really powerful work. I think it really enters into so much. There is a pretty overt reference here, I think, to Gauguin in the title, and she also seems to be referencing perhaps Van Gogh and this broader European craze for things East Asian at the turn of the 20th century. She's also, I think Shergill is also placing herself and her body and her subjectivity right square into the Western art tradition that she's been trained in and has been participating in. So as with the Frida Kahlo portrait, there's this very similar resoluteness. There's this self-ownership, identity ownership there. There's a real power in the expression on her face and also in her stance. So I think I would be interested in pairing these two to look at two women whose practices reacted, at least in part, to the very different political realities of two very different nations. And also to the lives and material cultures of people who live very differently than they did. And all of this, of course, swirled up with their own identities and how they fashioned their identities. So part of what I'd want to explore are some of those parallels, but also I think to explore some of the differences too. I think oftentimes when we're sort of grappling with an artist's practice, particularly an artist that seems less familiar to us or one that we know less, there is a tendency towards sort of crafting this problematic equivalency, which can gloss over so much. So part of what I'd want to do is insist on the nuance, insist on the divergence, as well as at the same time explore some of the parallels. I should add that I'm not the only person actually interested in this this visual dynamic and this somewhat parallel stories between these two artists, but I think it's such a rich place for providing a different lens or a different view to both artists. And I think pairing these two self-portraits would create a link to think about global modernisms, to think about the legacies of colonialism and responses to colonialism. There's just so much there to explore. Definitely something I'd love to explore more if given the chance. Actually, I'd love to explore all of these displays that we're talking about further. But I'll move on now to my next question for you both. So we have viewers who have loved Frida Kahlo and her work for a long time. We've got viewers who maybe are just beginning to love, beginning to learn about her life and her work. So based on your research and your experience with each of your exhibitions, if you could offer one takeaway, one thought that you believe viewers can take with them from this program that would be something that could add to a more general appreciation of Kahlo's work as a whole, what would that be? And maybe Adriana, if we could start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think starting with the self-portrait with Hummingbird necklace, obviously the conditions of the making or the circumstances of the making of that painting as a gift for Nicholas Marai are important. But I hope that viewers of this program will take a close look at the painting and think about both the ways in which Kahlo uses the iconography to create multiple entry points, but then also the ways in which the compositional structure, as Layla said, it's a very shallow compositional space. And in this instance, as in the two women from the MFA Boston's collection, the screen of leaves and plant life in the background really presses the figure forward. And so I would love for viewers to spend some time just looking at the painting and thinking about the sort of confrontation that they're being provided with the self-portrait of the artist, with the self-portrait by a woman at mid-century, with the complex array of iconography and all of the various things that can mean, right? Because some of the narrative around that painting is often that She was ending her relationship with Nicholas Marai at a period in which she and Rivera had divorced, and she was making the decision to remarry Diego Rivera. Certainly all of that is relevant. But I think that the painting offers an opportunity to think beyond that. And so I would encourage people to just really spend time looking at it, to really fixate on Kahlo's gaze and think about, well, what do I know? What is at the surface? And what is she asking me to think beyond and past that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great reminder. Look at it and look longer. Look longer than you think that you might otherwise do. Layla, what about you? What would be your takeaway?
I would add that overall, it might be helpful for viewers to know that Kahlo's paintings in general can be hard to classify as modernist, as surrealist, as highly, highly personal, self-taught art. And that's because she was constantly taking in so many different influences and shifting or innovating or evolving her own work. And also because her work includes performance. So the ways in which she dressed and self-fashioned and presented herself, this was also part of her practice. The combination, I think, of religious imagery, photography, nature, Mexican nationalism, those influences are perhaps no better harmonized anywhere than in the Ransom Center self-portrait. And I think that's one of the reasons that it has remained so iconic, because so many different people can look at it and see so many different stories wrapped up in a single picture.
Mm-hmm. Great. So one last question for both of you, and this is kind of related to a takeaway. There's a lot of material out there on Frida Kahlo. There's more coming out all the time. And so my question is, where can viewers start? Is there a resource or a book that you would recommend to Frida Kahlo fans who want to learn more about her work? Of course, it's a given that I'm going to include your two exhibition catalogs on any list that we make here today, but I wonder what you turn to. Layla, maybe we could start with you.
For those of you who know Spanish, I've been really interested in how the Museo Frida Kahlo, or the Casa Azul, has been uploading videos to their Facebook page, kind of since the pandemic started, even before that, I think. But they cover lots of different topics, and there's one in particular on arte popular with Marta Turok, who is an incredible scholar of Kahlo and traditional Mexican textiles. Google Arts and Culture, I've also been really impressed. They have several online exhibitions in English from museums in the US, Mexico, and probably even beyond that include a lot of archival materials and photographs that are often not possible to view in museums. And all of that is accessible now online.
Great. How about you, Adriana?
Well, I think, sort of picking up on the theme that Layla mentioned, there's a really wonderful book published by Chronicle in English, and there's a Spanish edition as well. The English edition is Self-Portrait in a Velvet Dress, and it has a wonderful essay by the same scholar that Layla mentioned, Marta Turok. It's all about the uncovering of a whole trove of Kahlo's belongings in a space that had been walled off at the Casa Azul by Diego Rivera, and was opened in the early 2000s under the direction of Carlos Phillips, who is the director of the Olmedo Museum that has control of the Frida Kahlo estate. And I really love that Marta Turok makes the observation that, Kahlo was not an ethnographic purist when it came to her dress. She mixed and matched things from different traditions, both indigenous Mexican traditions, so different pieces from different indigenous groups. But also, she had a pair of boots made out of fabric from China. So I think that's a really wonderful opportunity for those who are interested in Kahlo's creativity beyond her painting. And then there's a really nice biography of Frida Kahlo by Ganit and Corey that's published by the UK publisher Reaction Books. I mean, it is a biography, but it gives significant attention to Frida Kahlo's painting and her creativity and her vast knowledge of esoteric traditions. That's really been a specialty of Dr. Ancori's. The degree to which Kahlo was interested in Eastern religions and the ways in which she incorporated that iconography and that understanding into her creativity, I think is really useful. And it still offers readers enough of the sort of the biographical narrative to help them understand Kahlo's life story, but it does so in a way that really prioritizes her intellectual sort of contribution.
Yeah, some great resources there. I just want to conclude the program by once again thanking our guests, Adriana Zavala and Layla Bermeo, for a great conversation, one that I've really enjoyed and one that I hope viewers have enjoyed listening to. I thank you also for the really important curatorial contribution that each of your exhibitions has provided for thinking in a deeper way about Frida Kahlo's work and artistic practice. It's really been such a pleasure, and thank you to you both.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to be here and great to be in conversation, both with you, Tracy, and with Layla.
Absolutely. It's been an honor. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to visit the Ransom Center again.
We can't wait to have you, both of you.